Now, programming from the Illinois Channel, an independent, nonpartisan corporation formed to provide nonpartisan coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois. For more information on the Illinois Channel, please visit our website at www.illinoischannel.org.
Just ahead, we sit down with Cinda Edwards, the coroner for Sangamon County. We talk to her about the degree to which heroin is affecting central Illinois, as it is in many places throughout America, as well as the prevalence of accidental infant deaths as they sleep in bed with their parents. We also discuss the many different responsibilities of a coroner. Then in about 35 minutes, we talk to Matt Hart, the executive director of the Illinois Trucking Association, about the effort Illinois truckers have made to deliver aid to those affected by hurricanes in Texas and South Florida. And finally, in 50 minutes, we attend a panel hearing titled The Illinois Pension Disaster: What Went Wrong? Panelists include Dave McKinney, the former Springfield bureau chief for the Chicago Sun-Times, and Sheila Weinberg, the founder and CEO of Truth in Accounting, among others. That's all just ahead, after a brief word from one of our advisory council members.
Hi, I'm Dennis Bringett, owner of Ace Sign Company in Springfield. I'm also a member of the Illinois Channel's Advisory Council on Business Development. We build brands through visual communications. We design and fabricate in-house with our team of 49 associates. For our customers, a great sign is a showcase of who they are. For us, it means jobs for our employees and the ability to reinvest in new equipment to meet the demands of the future. Because as a manufacturer, if you don't invest in your business, you're not going to stay in business. Success in business can be very rewarding, but it also can be very challenging. Unfortunately, governments can sometimes make it very difficult with new policies and regulations that can raise the cost of production, hiring, and taxes. That's why we need to know what's happening at the state capitol and what's being proposed that can impact Illinois businesses and our employees. So lawmakers also need to hear from us, the small business owners, about the challenges that we face. And that's what we get from the Illinois Channel's coverage, to hear from the lawmakers and the governor, but also gives a voice to those of us in business. I'm Dennis Bringett, president of Ace Sign Company, and proud to serve on the Illinois Channel's Advisory Council on Business Development. The Illinois Channel, it keeps us connected to the issues that matter most.
Next, from Springfield, we sit down with Cinda Edwards, the coroner for Sangamon County. We talk to her about the degree to which heroin is affecting central Illinois, as it is in many places throughout America, as well as the prevalence of accidental infant deaths as they sleep in bed with their parents. We also discuss the many different responsibilities of a coroner. This runs about 35 minutes.
Cinda Edwards, great to have you back on the Illinois Channel. It's been a while since we had a chance to talk with you.
Thanks. Good to talk with you.
Over the recent history, a lot of people, we become increasingly aware of a trend that is a bad trend in our society, and it's this influx of heroin and opioids. And we are curious to talk to you about what are you seeing. You are the coroner for Sangamon County here in central Illinois. The Springfield is part of Sangamon County. What is it you're seeing, your experience in, as far as this epidemic going on?
Well, when I first became coroner, it caught my eye because, of course, coming from the nursing field and working in a physician's office, walk-in facility plus primary care, we saw a lot of people seeking medications. But then when I became the coroner and I was out on the streets, you know, you actually see what's happening with these drugs and the diversion that's going out there. So, you know, opiates have been popular probably for centuries. I think probably in the last 10 years, the prescription opiates had been going up, and then there was the whole controversy with OxyContin, who, when they put that out. They put out a big sales push to the physicians that it wasn't addictive, and it ended up being the most addictive prescription opiate around. So there's a lot of people that get started on opiates by prescription due to post-surgical, post-injury, and a lot of there's a fair amount of those people that they don't get addicted, but there's some people that it seems to hit the trigger for them, and off they go on to addiction, and so most of the opiates, prescription opiates, have Tylenol mixed with them, and so even if you have to take more and more and more prescriptions to feed your addiction, everyone knows that if you take too much Tylenol, you can damage your liver. So due to maybe that thought, cost of the prescriptions, if you can't get the doctor to prescribe them, then you go out and buy them on the street. They're expensive. People end up turning to heroin, which is an opiate.
What age brackets are we seeing?
Well, it's interesting you say that because I did a spreadsheet on just opioid deaths from 2014 and May of 2017 is when we did it, and it was all over the board is age. Predominantly Caucasians. And then the ages anywhere from teenagers to people in around 60. So it was quite interesting. We did a spreadsheet, and I'll give you a copy of education level and age and ethnicity. So, and then we have the different opiates listed, which sometimes people their overdose will be a mixed bag of drugs together. Not just simply heroin, but maybe heroin, methamphetamine, cocaine. So. I try to pick out the one for the main offender, I call it. I try to pick out the one at the highest level.
As people become addicted inadvertently through medicine that was prescribed, is the heroin then the fill-in drug after? Is it because it's cheaper, because it still gives them their opiate?
Yeah, and they may need more opiate as they go along, and the prescription medications aren't cutting it, or they're too expensive, like I said, or they have Tylenol in them, they can't take enough. So if you go to heroin, we all know heroin's not made in an FDA-approved laboratory. So you don't know what you're getting. And recently, we've heard that there's been fentanyl, carfentanil, acetylfentanyl, all these fentanyls mixed in with the heroin. And so that makes it even more lethal, especially the carfentanil. That's the one that's used on large mammals in zoos. So,
who are we to blame? Is anything being done to address this?
I think there's certainly the doctors educating the physicians, and I think that's been done. It's more and more.
Are they cutting down now?
I think so. I'd have to get a statistic, from the pharmacy companies on, or from the drugstores on, if they see the numbers of the hydrocodones and the prescription opiates going down. But it's more difficult for physicians to prescribe because they have changed the level of the drug category so that you have to have a written prescription. It can't be just called in, so it has to be a written prescription, and they can't put refills on it. So every time you get it filled, you have to get a written prescription from your physician, which it makes it more difficult for somebody to call in and pretend you're from the physician's office and call in a prescription for.
Which I imagine used to happen, right?
Yeah.
When you, of course, as a coroner, you're dealing with people who die from. What's killing them? Is it the prescription drugs? Or is it predominantly the heroin? Well,
we have a really mixed bag of opiates. I want to say when I did this, I had fentanyl, morphine, methadone, hydrocodone, oxycodone, and then this was all heroin. So I would say heroin probably was the primary offender. And then this year is when in the Sangamon County area where we started seeing these synthetic fentanyls, the designer fentanyls.
And a fentanyl is, again, kind of a chemical
fentanyl is
version
it's
of an
a
opiate.
synthetic. It's a synthetic opiate or morphine. It's synthetic, and it's very strong. It comes in patches, and it's usually used for people that are like at end of life.
Who are suffering a lot of pain, maybe
Right,
they're dying of
right.
cancer or something.
Right, exactly. So, and they've changed those, they have a reservoir, and people would slit the reservoir and scoop out, it's supposed to be a time release thing, and just scoop it out or smoke them or eat them or, unbelievable.
And that's highly dangerous.
Oh, yeah. And so now they're seeming to mix these fentanyls where I hear are imported maybe from China and maybe mixed in with the heroin.
I think these are being shipped in via the mails or just delivery services,
Yeah,
right?
and then maybe even mixed with the heroin down in Mexico. I don't know. From what I hear,
And as you say, these are not FDA-approved drugs.
Yeah, exactly. So when a family says, I think it was a bad batch, I'm like, yeah, every batch of heroin is bad because you have no idea how much heroin is in it or whatever is in it.
Some guy in the back alley is following their own recipe, and you don't know what they're doing.
There for a long time, we were having a substance called levamisole that was being mixed in heroin, and what it is a dewormer used in cattle. Well, the reason they would put it in the heroin to make it look like more, and it was odorless and colorless and non-detectable. But what it would do, it would cause necrosis of the vein, and the addicts would get these horrible sores everywhere because the vein and the tissue would die around where they injected, and it was awful,
Has the number of deaths in recent years been increasing, or is it held steady?
Well, okay, so I have statistics from 2012 on forward, and so in 2012 we had 29 opiate-related deaths. In 2013 it went down. It was a good year, only 14. And then in 2014 it went up to 32. 2015, 41. 2016 got a little bit better. It was 23. But in 2017 we have 24 to 6 to 7, 34 so far. And we still have 3 months to go.
So big jump.
And I have a couple in the drawer right now that I know, 3 that are going to be overdoses.
And you say the age bracket for the overdoses is across the board.
It's across the board, right?
Is it also across the demographics? I mean, do you see people who are middle class or upper middle class, but they got addicted from a pain medication or something? So it's not your stereotypical low-income druggie in some alley somewhere.
No, it can be, but there's a lot of the other too. And another thing that I've noticed is families of an addict are often under a lot of, they've gone through a lot of stress trying to get
help them, their family
help their
member.
family member.
That was going to be a question. What resources or help is there available, if any, to families?
Well, I mean, there are addiction clinics. Gateway is an example of one in Springfield. But there are also medications that can be given that are opiate receptor blockers so that they won't get the effects from the opiates. But, you really have to go through a detox program and just like quitting smoking, you have to really want to do it. And it's a very difficult addiction to overcome.
But the good news...
But unlike cigarettes, I don't think you can go through a dangerous withdrawal from opiates.
Could that threaten your life as well?
Right.
the withdrawal.
So it should be done under supervision.
Not just cold turkey
Right.
necessarily. Before we move on to a different topic, within the law enforcement and medical community, are there conferences being held addressing this on an ongoing basis, and is there any great ideas or breakthrough or coordination happening?
Well, we've had 2, maybe 3 opiate summits in Springfield, and it's included a vast variety of people, from people from the school districts, people from the medical community, people from, rehab facilities, law enforcement, coroners, just anybody that may have anything to do with this crisis. And we've had 2 or 3 meetings, and there's been some really great feedback. So that's an ongoing.
Is that actionable feedback, or is it still kind of in the kicking the ideas around stage?
There were a few actionable items last time, and so the next meeting will hopefully get the feedback on those.
Lastly, as a coroner, you don't do the autopsies yourself. You hire I would imagine that's
we contract with a.
Is that typical, or?
Yeah. Well, in Illinois, it is the only county that has a medical examiner system, where the coroner is a forensic pathologist, so it's a medical examiner system is Cook County.
I was going to say, when I was watching the old TV shows with Jack Klugman and all, might think that the coroner is doing it. But the point is, so you work with a doctor that does the autopsies, and you get the information.
So Springfield, Sangamon County, we have a little over 200,000 people, and probably our county alone is it would not be large enough to employ a full-time forensic pathologist. So what that pathologist does is he also takes counties, surrounding counties, and contracts with them and does their cases as well. So. And
what kind of cost is involved in an autopsy, and with the increase in the death, the impact of the heroin and opioid deaths, what impact is that having on the county government budget to run your office?
Well, it's the autopsy line is one line that's somewhat unpredictable in my budget, and the opiate crisis has certainly increased that. We certainly don't want to miss anything, and we want to do a complete exam and have an accurate cause of death and manner of death. So we do a complete autopsy on someone that is suspected to have overdosed. So I want
is
to say,
that by law, or I mean, can the family say we don't want an autopsy? I'm just curious.
Well, if the family says they don't want an autopsy, but the coroner says we're going to have one, we're going to have one.
And in that, you would run take blood
every
and samples and find out.
Every autopsy we do the same thing: a complete autopsy, photography, and a complete toxicology analysis.
And that's where you could find out what they've been on, or what.
Oh, absolutely,
what was
absolutely. And then we also, in our investigations, we talk to Illinois Prescription Monitoring Program, find out if they've been prescribed anything. We speak with their primary care physicians, their specialists, find out, what kind of things they've been to the hospital or the emergency room for, and get a complete social, medical history on that person, so that you kind of have a good idea going in. But then the autopsy is the definitive thing that really clarifies everything and puts the definite cause of death to the situation.
Moving on to, no one likes to think about death. It's an unnecessary or an unpleasant reality of life. Here you deal with it all the time. One of the things that you had mentioned to me off camera that I think people ought to hear about, which is something I hadn't thought about before you brought it up, is the number of young infants that are killed inadvertently by sleeping with their parents.
Yeah, it could be sleeping with parents, sleeping with other siblings. It could be inappropriate bedding. There's a variety of things, but it's usually death by asphyxiation. So a baby doesn't have good control of their head, and if they get in a situation, they can't get themselves out of it. So whether it be smothered up against somebody's body, up against a pillow, you know, we've had ones where the baby was sleeping with an adult on the couch, and the adult fell asleep, and the baby got wedged between the pillow and the adult. I mean, they're very tragic cases, and they're very. I mean, you can imagine for a parent, they're just awful. So, as far as
what is the age that we're talking about?
Well, anywhere from newborn to usually most are less than 9 months, because by that age they're getting a little more independent, able to pull themselves up and out of situations where they're, you know, their head is stronger, their neck muscles are stronger, and that. So, but it is heartbreaking, and we always do a reenactment with every child death, and we have a bean baby doll, and it's a very, very emotional process. I hate doing it, but it's necessary, and so we'll have the parents show us exactly what the bedding was, where the baby was placed last to be known alive, and then where they found the baby in what position. So,
what's the value of that reenactment?
It is just clarifying the circumstances surrounding the death, and a lot of times you get that aha moment. You know, well, I see exactly what happened, and it's usually.
And if they have another child, they'll, well, you know, what I mean, they know what not to do, obviously.
Right.
How many deaths in Sangamon County? And Sangamon County is hardly the highest population in the state.
So initially I thought there was about 8. It's just that they're so gut-wrenching and tough to deal with. It's more like 4 to 5 a year. But I sit on the child death review team, and our team covers multiple counties. And every one of us on the child death review team is like, okay, another baby asphyxiation. You know, and it really, like 3 years ago, we started driving it home. You know?
Well, and in Cook County would be obviously a lot higher because of the density of the population.
Right,
but
Cook
with
County is
102 counties. If you only had 5 a year, that's over 500 babies that die.
Yeah, it's a lot.
And given the size of Cook County, I wouldn't be surprised if it's like 1,000 or, you know, north of 500 or 700. You know, it's a lot of unnecessary babies dying just from something simple.
Yes, and so, you know, I think in the past maybe labeling it SIDS to make the parents feel better, not to make the parents feel better, but it made everybody feel better. And I think it's better to deal with the truth. Let's get the word out there. And DCFS is doing a big campaign educating parents when they leave the hospital back to sleep in a crib. Just a sheet, just a fitted sheet, no blankets, pillows, anything that could smother on their back. And, you know, and if a child would die in those exact sleeping circumstances, then it may be from either illness or it may be SIDS.
Is there any effort to get that word out? I mean, hopefully this video will help some.
Well, the hospitals are giving the parents the information. Pediatricians are giving the information. DCFS has a campaign, the Back to Sleep. There's billboards. So, you know, and oftentimes, you know, parents are, when you have a newborn, you're sleep deprived. So, you know, you may sleep more heavily, roll over on the baby, and inadvertently. Or even if you've had a drink, you know, you may sleep more soundly. So,
obviously a horrible tragedy, and hopefully making this more aware, we can cut down on those incidents. Before we close out, let's just talk a little bit about the coroner's office in general. I guess every county in the state has a coroner?
Every county just about does. There's a few of the smaller counties that it's done through the sheriff's office, and there's someone appointed in the sheriff's office to be the death investigator. But other than that, we have 102 counties, I believe, in Illinois. So the Cook County has the medical examiners, and then everything else is a coroner.
And I was going to ask, how do you simply describe what is the purpose of the coroner's office? And you just said the death investigator. I guess maybe that's the bumper sticker.
We clarified the facts surrounding a death. And so, Obviously death is a very traumatic and I mean, end of life is definitely an important thing to have a look at. So we take a second look, and then
now is that on any? I mean, if you have a person who's 98 years old and they die in a nursing home, do you take a look at that death?
Not necessarily. Anyone that dies at home and they're not under home hospice, we go and investigate. That doesn't mean there's going to be an autopsy. We look for any signs of abuse, neglect, injury, foul play, anything like that. And if there's natural disease, we'll call their doctor, talk to them, and but we take pictures to document the absence of injury and get a complete medical history on the person. So anybody that dies in their residence, as I said, and is not under hospice, anybody that dies in the emergency room, we go and just clarify the facts surrounding that.
How many investigators or staff would you have, and is it enough?
Well, I have 2 full-time death investigators, and I have a secretary. And then I have probably 10 to 12 part-time deputies that work in the evenings and weekends. But, of course, they must call me whenever they're going on a case and discuss the case with me. And I help them with the decision. But they're usually my eyes and ears on the case. And
so if someone gets killed on Highway 55, do you go out to the accident scene, or?
Mm-hmm. Unless the victim is transported to the emergency room and then passes away at the emergency room. We may go back if it's a unique circumstance, and we'll talk to on the interstate, it's going to be the state police doing the investigation. So we might talk to them. We may go back and take a look at the scene. But as far as the accident part goes, we usually rely on the police agency because they do the accident reconstruction and all that.
Now, families might say, what's the point of that? They got killed in an accident.
Yeah, it is a point because, some accidents, somebody may have a medical event that causes the accident and they don't actually die from the injuries.
It could have been a stroke while they were driving.
Exactly. We just clarify this. You can't. It's not possible to be driving down the road and somebody shoots through the window and the crash. You can't tell there was a shot. That would be very rare, but it just erases any sort of foul play theory. And I think for the money that we spend clarifying that, making sure the family they have all the answers they're seeking, is well worth the money than there being maybe a murder conspiracy later on, or lawyers involved, because the $1,500 that we spend on a autopsy, I don't know what a lawyer's fee are, but if you get lawyers involved, your $1,500 isn't going to last long. So,
and the other thing is, to what extent, one, does the information you gather, you say, here's how many babies have died, here's how many people have died from opioids, do you classify every death, and once you gather those statistics, do they just stay here in Sangamon County, or is there a national database that's built?
There's IVRS is what we put our statistics into. That's what we put our death certificates into, and they derive statistics every year for state level from what we put as the cause and manner of death. So they do generate reports from that. I also am always in fairly good contact with the local police departments and the DEA as to what we're finding on our toxicology reports and how things are going there. Another thing that we do is if we go to a home death and there are controlled substances in the home that belong to the person that passed away, we take those drugs from the home so they cannot be redistributed or misused. We have a locked cabinet. We count them, lock them, and then the DEA has every 6 months they do a drug roundup and they take them and they're incinerated. So
interesting, because that now is another thing that would not have occurred to me. We've had Mothers Against Drunk Driving for a long time. How are we doing on drunk driving? And that would be another reason why you would investigate an accident, right? It might be that the person was inebriated.
Right. So we have every accident, we have a form we have to fill out for the state called an SR8. And on there, if we do if it's the driver, we put down what their blood alcohol is. Interestingly enough, I'm not sure that the laws have quite caught up with medical marijuana. There is a quantification level, but it's a blood test, and I'm not sure how enforced that is, because
so there's somewhat of an equivalency, if I'm hearing you right, to marijuana intoxication versus the alcohol intoxication, and there's some trip level, I guess.
Yeah, there's several different metabolites from marijuana, and in the urine, marijuana can stay in your system for a month or two. So a urine test is not going to tell you about if someone was actively high on marijuana and shouldn't be driving. So I think it's the delta carboxy THC is the ingredient that usually disappears within 1 to 2 hours of ingesting marijuana. So, you know, I think we've established a state level, but as far as you know, the police taking you to get the blood, it's a blood draw, you know, and all that. I'm not sure how that's going, but I have a sense that things need to catch up with medical marijuana laws.
And as we close out, in so many offices, there's like a wish list of things. If you could change things, if you could implement some changes, I don't know if you have any that you are on your wish list to change. Sometimes you can't get the attention of either the legislature or the governor, whoever it might be, to make some changes that would improve the functioning of coroners' offices, or just perhaps getting rid of some of the problems that are faced in society.
Right.
Is there anything that comes to mind from your experience?
Well, I think there's been a national movement to unify the process that coroners' offices go through nationally, because every coroner's office operates a little bit differently, and so there are no qualifications put in place that you have to be a coroner. You just have to get one more vote than your opponent.
Are they all elected?
Yeah. Well, the medical examiner is appointed in Chicago's appointed
so
by the
you could have a
Cook
used
County
car
Board.
salesman run for coroner.
If he can convince the voters that he'd be the best option. There's been an increase in medical people taking on I think medical people are kind of not used to running for office, but
and you have a medical background, and
right.
Are you one of the few coroners with a medical?
Well, when I first became coroner, yes, but there's more and more. So
And what difference does it make to have a medical background, since you have a doctor doing the autopsies?
Yes, but there's so many cases that we have to determine, and that so much information that I need to give to my pathologist. I need to explain the autopsy report to the family, so they're left with the proper, they feel like they're fully informed. And then when I make a decision whether to do an autopsy or not, I can understand they have these risk factors. I look at their past medical history, and I can say with a certain amount of reasonable doubt. I mean, I'm sure it's natural, and I can say with a reasonable amount of certainty that it's probably maybe cardiovascular related. So. I think that takes some medical background to be able to determine that.
Are you arguing that coroners should, this is a good thing have some kind of medical background and not just have anyone serve?
I don't want to say, I'm just saying that I think a medical background is helpful. There are the types of people that usually are vocations that usually are in coroners' offices are law enforcement, medical people, and in a lot of the smaller counties, it's funeral home directors. So, I don't want to say, there's some very good, very, very good coroners in those other vocations. So I don't want to belittle them, but I think just a unification of a process to go through, some criteria to the ABMDI certification, I think, is good. It's American Board of Medical Legal Death Investigation. and it kind of outlines a death investigation, properly done death investigation, all the steps you need to go through.
And lastly, there's conferences. It's seemingly in almost any field. Are there conferences for coroners where you can learn from your counterparts?
Right. And that's a great thing. You know, you can go back for. We have Illinois conferences where it's just the Illinois, and then there's national conferences. Usually the national conference is out in Las Vegas, so everybody rolls their eyes. But, oh my gosh, poor Clark County out there, you know, with the recent shootings, 59 deceased. I can't imagine it. I've been out to that coroner's office a couple of times, and it's a very good coroner's office because, as you can imagine, in Las Vegas, they need to have things down.
And I guess in a mass death episode like that, you're going to do an autopsy, I suppose, on all of them to understand the cause. Probably have to just bring in people from out of the area too.
Though I don't know if they do or not. Or if they just pace it and they're going to do so many a day and get through them. I'm not sure how they're handling that.
Obviously you're going to have a deadline of sorts to get the families looking to have a funeral,
Oh, exactly. And that's one thing. You don't want to hold the families up with having a funeral, but you do want to clarify exactly what happened. And in Illinois, we have mutual aid agreements signed between a lot of the coroners. So if we have a mass casualty situation, I'm going to have coroners from other counties. They're going to send their staff up, and they're going to help me. And that's so valuable, because when you have a mass casualty.
And the last thing, there's so many aspects of this job, and it's an office we so seldom hear about, but you have an impact, as we've already discussed, on fighting ongoing addiction, the baby deaths, and as we're talking here, also working with law enforcement and going to trial, because a lot of times the evidence that you're gathering, if it is ruled a homicide, is going to be critical to a trial.
Yeah, and most assuredly the forensic pathologist is going to be called to trial, but from the time the incident occurs to somebody going to trial, it's usually 4 to 5 years, by the time there's, and then some of the cases actually, there's a plea agreement, so they don't end up going to trial. But you sure want to have everything right and everything documented in case it does go to trial, so, justice can be served.
And the last thing, and this might sound, in this digital age, what are we doing with the records, which might include X-rays? Do you X-ray the bodies?
We do in certain cases.
That could show abuse, perhaps.
Oh yeah,
right?
All children are X-rayed head to toe to look for old healing fractures, acute fractures, signs of old abuse. Anybody that's had a shooting or a stab wounds is X-rayed. Anybody that's been in a fire, because you can't say how well they're charred, but is there a bullet in there? That's going to show up on X-ray. Mm-hmm. Anybody that is decomposed, we can't really, we'll take X-rays to make sure there's no broken bones or the skull wasn't crushed in before or they died or whatever. So not every case gets X-rays. But those cases
and
always
all of
do.
Those records, how do we preserve them?
And so they're kept, the ones on film are here in our evidence room. The hospitals obviously have gone to disc, so from here on out we're going to be going with a disc system, so it'll be on a disc, and the hospital will probably hold a copy, and then we have a copy in the chart for the decedent.
Well, Cinda Edwards, we've already taken more time than I expected, but we appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us.
Okay, thanks, Terry.
Thank you.
Next, from Springfield, we talked to Matt Hart, the executive director of the Illinois Trucking Association, about the effort Illinois truckers have made to deliver aid to those affected by hurricanes in Texas and South Florida. This runs about 15 minutes.
Matt Hart, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois Channel. A lot of people have obviously been following the news of late, and we've had several major hurricanes hitting the United States, both in Texas and in Florida, and of course in Puerto Rico. But what a lot of people, I think, haven't heard is the involvement of the Illinois Truckers Association and the amount of charity that is coming from Illinois. It's a commendable story, and we wanted to kind of flesh it out and let people be aware of some of the good works that are being done. What is the role of the Illinois Truckers Association in getting some needed supplies, let's say, down to Texas?
Yeah. Well, we're doing a lot of things to try and help the people who've been affected by the hurricanes in both Texas and in Florida. Almost immediately when we began to see what was happening in Texas and the devastation that the hurricane caused in Texas and the needs that were down there, almost immediately we had members of the Illinois Trucking Association who were responding, trying to find ways to get supplies down there. Of course, one of our concerns in our experience, every time you have a natural disaster, the main thing is to make sure that you've got, there's this automatic outpouring of support initially, but we want to make sure that we had reliable places where we could take things, and also we were serving the need where we were taking the right things down to Texas and down to Florida. So we started working with, we had some members that started working with charitable organizations down in Texas immediately. The Illinois Trucking Association got involved by helping coordinate efforts all across the state, as well as working with our members who have locations in Texas. And we shortly found out one of our members has a trucking terminal near Houston, and so that's where we've been coordinating a lot of our efforts, is to making sure they get so that we have a place to unload a truck, so that we know exactly what they need, and then we're not sending supplies down there that they don't need. And so we've it's been a little bit of both our members independently taking things down there with their connections down there, the Illinois Trucking Association collecting items all across the state, getting them down there. We've offered up to all of our members across the state that if you want to do collections at your trucking company terminal, we will come with our ITA truck, and we've got a small ITA tractor and trailer. We will come pick those items up. We consolidate them in one of 2 points. We're either consolidating them in the Joliet area at one of our members, or we're consolidating them with one of our members in southern Illinois near the St. Louis area, and finding ways to get them part of other loads and get them down to Texas.
So if people listen to this and they thought, hey, I'd like to donate something, is there some way to make a contribution, or do they have to be in either the St. Louis area or Joliet area? No,
right now we've told all of our members, if you've got a trucking company anywhere in the state and you're collecting items there, the ITA will come pick those items up, and depending on where they're at and what the need is, then we're going to get them either to the St. Louis area or get them to the Joliet area and consolidate them with the other loads then that we've got going down to Texas or to Florida.
And I believe I'm right. You just came from an effort right now where high school kids are also getting involved, right?
Junior high school, yeah. Rochester Junior High School. The students there were challenged with, how could we help the people affected by the hurricanes? And there was a group that decided that it would be great to collect items and get them down there. One of those students was my daughter, who's a student at Rochester Junior High School, and she called me up one afternoon and said, "Daddy, can we we need a truck. Would you be able to provide a truck?" And I said, "Well, honey, I run the Illinois Trucking Association. Yes, we've got trucks, and we've got members that have trucks, so we will get the items down there." And so that's where I just came from. They collected 4 pallets worth of items: paper towels, cleaning supplies, brooms, diapers, toothbrushes, toothpaste, things to really help with the cleanup efforts right now. That's what's going on right now in Texas, is just trying to help folks get their lives back together, get their homes cleaned, and back to trying to get life back to normal for folks.
As we tape this, it's been, roughly 3 weeks, I suppose, since Houston was hit. Do you know offhand, approximately how many runs have you made down to Texas with truck and the supplies?
Oh, it's hard to gauge. We've had so many members, and one of the things I love about working in the trucking industry, there's just been this outpouring of support, and it's people all across the state running trucking companies, donating trucks, donating trailers, donating drivers, donating fuel, many of whom, the overwhelming majority of whom, want absolutely no recognition for it. They just want to help, and they don't want any recognition for it. And so that's what's been fantastic in watching the relief efforts, is just the outpouring of support. And we've had fuel donations, we've had drivers donated, we've had one member who's donated a tractor, another member donated a trailer, all to get products down and materials down, and cleanup supplies down to Texas and to Florida.
And when we say that they're donating, as an example, their drivers, those drivers are getting paid.
Right.
So, you got the cost of the drivers, you got the cost of the fuel. Yeah. It can be a substantial financial commitment from just approximately what kind of cost would it go to send a truck down to Houston and back.
Yeah. Well, you've got, I mean, when you're sending them to Houston, you know, you're talking 2 or 3 days, maybe 4 days of getting the truck and trailer down there and back. Fuel alone is about $1,000. A lot of people don't understand how much fuel it takes to run an 18-wheeler. It costs about $1,000 in fuel to get a truckload of material from Illinois to Houston and back. And you know, that's a huge expense that a lot of our members have been taking on. We've also been helping out with efforts to collect more money for fuel. We've had members that have just that don't have trucks or trailers, but wanted to help out and have donated money that we've then been helping to get that money to our trucking company members who are purchasing the fuel to get product down.
Now, you have, as you say, you're working with some of the truckers in Texas. And have you gotten any feedback, I mean, in terms of how appreciative they are, what a difference these donations have made?
Absolutely. And it's you know, when the first 2 or 3 days after the hurricane had gone through Texas, we had a conference call with one of our members, our member that's got the terminal just outside of Houston. And it really breaks your heart when you hear the stories of, you know, having no power, having no access to your house, living in a shelter. And I mean, these are middle class folks who, you know, normally, you know, are have a home, and they're just out of their home, and now they're trying to put the pieces back together. And every little bit is helping, and we're constantly, you know, hearing from our members, particularly down in Texas, who are thankful for, you know, everything that we're sending down there.
How long will this donation, these runs go on? Do you imagine? Have you guys talked about this? Let's say going to Houston.
Well, I think we're starting to hopefully getting to the end. Like I said, right now we're focusing on the cleanup efforts, and so there's just been a huge outpouring of support, helping out in the Houston area. I know that's right now the cleanup is the main thing that's going on there, and people are getting their lives back together, and things are starting to get back to normal for a lot of people down there. That's our focus right now, and just in helping them get cleaned up from the debris. There's just it's kind of an overwhelming task when you have that large of a metropolitan area that's been impacted, and you can't get to everybody immediately. So we expect, you know, as long as they continue to have the need, we'll continue to get supplies down there to help them put their lives back together.
And, I mean, this is, again, it's a great story, one that, as I said, I think it's been, to my knowledge, not really reported on. Is this kind of an organic effort? I mean, no one reached out to you and suggested doing this. The state didn't, right? I mean, right. It just, how did this actually come about? Was it just some phone calls being made between trucking companies?
It really was. It was completely organic. You know, as I said, we have experience in the past with, particularly with Hurricane Katrina. We have members that took truckloads of materials and supplies down to Hurricane Katrina, and there was no place to take them. There was no place for the truck to unload, and we had trucks that were stranded down there for days. And so we were very cautious and made sure that we had a reliable person or companies down there that could take product, and also we wanted to know exactly what they needed. We quickly found out, you know, we had a lot of people that wanted to donate clothes or donate shoes, and we were, you know, quickly told we don't need clothes, we don't need shoes, we need, you know, we need cleaning supplies, we need bleach, we need laundry detergent, we need buckets, we need brooms, we need the things that are going to help us clean up and get our lives back together. And so with having members, and of course in the trucking industry, we have a lot of members that you know, transport goods all over the country, and so it wasn't hard to find someone in that area who was impacted and affected, and that's where it all started with us. It is getting these items to our member that was down there. Of course, we knew then that they had a trucking company. We knew they had a dock. We knew they had a place that could collect these things. Or, you know, if you know, a couple of items or a couple of truckloads we sent were almost entirely food and water. Those went directly to some other places that needed the food and water. So they were helping us direct through their local efforts down there as well.
And a couple of things, obviously, and unfortunately, we've had 3 hurricanes in a relatively short period of time, in about a month. Also, Florida got hit. Are you also doing any runs to Florida?
Yeah, we are. We're working again with some more of the relief agencies in Florida and getting supplies down there that need to get down there as well. You know, and we even talked earlier about, you know, Puerto Rico. Obviously, we can't drive a truck to Puerto Rico. We wish that we could. If we could, we would certainly be taking items down there because Puerto Rico has been devastated. However, it looks like we're going to be able to help out, possibly sending some drivers. So we're looking at sending drivers to Puerto Rico to help out with their efforts, because what's going on in Puerto Rico right now is devastating as well. And we're willing and able to help in any way that we can.
Has there been any outreach to the federal government? I mean, again, the charity is commendable. Has anyone said, maybe FEMA or some other department of the federal government could compensate the companies so that they can continue to do some of this, charity, or at least, underwrite some of the costs? Has any of that been done?
Yeah, and we have members who are working through FEMA, and some of them were already approved FEMA contractors, and some of them have already been added as additional FEMA contractors. And those are good, and that helps, with the entire effort. In the trucking industry, we're a service industry. Our job is to serve our customers, and so it's an easy fit for whenever you see people that are in need, and we have trucks that can get materials to people, whether it's through FEMA or whether it's from, hey, we've got a member in outside of Houston, Texas, that knows the items that we need, has a place that we can bring them. We'll whether we work through FEMA or whether we work through our own members, we'll help people out.
Yeah, and you kind of, I think, answered. So a question I had was, how do you know what to send? You're getting feedback from the people on the ground down, whether in Florida or Texas, and then you have these collection sites. And I suppose, as we mentioned with your daughter's school, maybe you say, here's the kind of things we're looking for.
Right.
I suppose the school maybe sent a note out to the parents or something, and then it's collected, you have a truck over, and then you kind of bring all that together. When you drive, let's say, to Houston, I'm just curious, is it just a direct shot, or do you coordinate with, let's say, the Arkansas Trucking Association, stop off in Little Rock and pick up some stuff along the way?
Well, we haven't done that because we've been trying to load our trucks up completely here in Illinois. So, the federal government has helped out in that there are regulations about how long you can drive. They have relaxed those regulations if you are involved in the hurricane relief efforts. So that helps a little bit as far as the timing of getting material to Texas and getting drivers back to Illinois. So we have been, utilizing those advantages that the federal government is giving us. But right now we're working with anybody and everybody to collect goods. It's we had just one example. We had a member in Rockford that had. They themselves did not have the food, but they had a customer that had a lot of food that they wanted to donate, and they didn't have the capacity to take this truckload of food from Rockford all the way down to Texas, nor did they have know who to get it to in Texas. So they actually brought a truckload, actually multiple truckloads of food from Rockford to Joliet, to one of our other members, where we had an available warehouse where we'd been consolidating loads, and we took that truckload of food. We took it, and then we would take about half of that. We would mix it in with cleaning supplies, and then get that down to Texas. And so we're again working closely with our members in Texas and the Texas Trucking Association as well, our affiliate in Texas, finding out what do people need, where do they need it, and how can we get it to them.
Lastly, I don't know if there's if somebody wants to donate, how would they, who would they contact, and how would they go about doing it?
Well, they can certainly contact the Illinois Trucking Association. They can go on our website and get our contact information, or call our phone number, or either of our offices, our office in Springfield or our office in Chicagoland, and we'll be happy to connect them if they want to donate money for fuel. That's really helpful right now. Is we've got a lot of people who have been sending drivers and sending trucks, but after you send 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 truckloads or 20 truckloads, it doesn't hurt to have some help in paying for fuel. So that's what we've been taking some donations to help pay for fuel right now. But also, if you do want to get goods, if you've got goods that you want to donate, just find a member of the Illinois Trucking Association, get it to their trucking terminal, and the ITA will come pick those items up, and we'll make sure they get to Texas or Florida.
It's a great story of how Americans come together to help each other.
Yeah. It really has been great, and as I said earlier, not only do we have trucking company members that want to help, but they do it and they don't want any recognition for it. They just want to help people, and we're a service industry, and we're made up of men and women who serve every day and deliver the goods that people want. And so if we can continue to serve and help people out that are in need, we'll help anybody.
Well, on behalf of all the viewers, thank you, Matt Hart, for joining us, and thank your members for all their charitable works.
Right. Thank you, Terry.
Next, as Illinois' unfunded pension liability continues to affect state politics, we run an encore presentation of a roundtable from 2015 titled The Illinois Pension Disaster: What Went Wrong? Speakers include Dave McKinney, a reporter with Reuters, and Sheila Weinberg, the founder of the Institute for Truth in Accounting, among others. This runs about 50 minutes.
Set the stage, and Peter, Eric, and Sheila will follow. David McKinney.
Thanks, Paul. You are always a tough act to follow. I'm sure you've heard that before. Thank you for having me here. And this project that I worked on with Cranes was kind of a byproduct of me being out of work for a while. I set out to do freelancing, and one day Cranes called me up and said, how about doing a history of how we got into this mess at the state level? And my first reaction was to kind of roll my eyes a little bit, because we all know we're in a mess, and what new things are there out there to tell? And so I sat around and I thought about it for a little bit, and one of the sort of the starting point for me, I guess because maybe it was freshest in my mind, was in 2004 when the Blagojevich administration started out with it was a big pension bill that had some reforms in it. It was, one of the things they were doing was targeting superintendents and school administrators from getting the big pay hikes, and then that would, we were all paying the higher pension costs as a result. Tucked in that were a couple of other interesting things. One was, a 2-year pension holiday. And I thought, let's see if we can calculate what is the long-term cost of, basically cutting your pension payments in half for 2 years. And so that's how I decided to tackle the project first. And I went digging, and surprisingly, it was sort of hard to find that number. There were no recent numbers out there, and I just kept digging and looking into the bill and pulling up the transcripts of the floor debates just to refresh myself about, what was said about the bill and everything. And, the deeper I got into that particular piece of legislation, the more I began to see that, I saw some trends developing. One was, this was a bill that landed in the legislators' laps 2 days before adjournment. It had been worked on clearly for a long period of time, but it was something, unless you were in the negotiations, you were not going to be privy to all the details of it. And there was, the sponsors of it, as they laid out the various pieces, they talked about overall the thing could wind up saving, as much as $35 billion over, the next 40 years. And, the one thing that struck me about it, though, was that the Commission on Government Forecasting and Accountability, COGFA, there's a pension note attached to it, and they're very good. They've got a lot of great people at COGFA that keep track of this stuff. And the pension note that was attached to this bill said, it's going to cost you more, but we can't tell you how much. And I thought, well, that's an interesting thing. If you're a rank and file legislator, that's those are your experts. They're the ones who will tell you really what the true cost of something is. And, they were basically having to take votes and not knowing what the true cost of it was, at least according to COGFA. And so, I started digging more in the COGFA reports and found that, 3 or 4 months later, COGFA published something that said, the cost of skipping those pension payments, along with tying in some costs that were associated with George Ryan's early retirement program, could wind up costing as much as $6.8 billion. And that was stunning to me. That was not ever discussed on the floor. Neither chamber talked about that price. And it just occurred to me that, all right, this is interesting. So I then decided to pick out a bunch of other points in time, going all the way back to Jim Thompson. And the point when compounding COLAs came into being in 1989, that was a good starting point. And then the Edgar ramp was another point that I looked at. And then the early retirement program I mentioned. And so over and over again, what I was seeing was that the numbers that were put in front of legislators proved to be way off as they were studied longer. And you would see times where debate was squelched with a stopwatch. And the reason that happens, of course, is that these things, it's a log jam at the end of sessions, and there's so much stuff that they have to do. And so to get it all done, you've got to limit debate. Well, should debate be limited on something that's going to cost the state $6 billion? I mean, that's an open question. But what I found, I just found this trend. And you'll hear from Peter here in a minute. One of his sound bites really just stuck with me. Sometimes it just looks like they don't understand the math. And Peter can talk more about that, but you know, that was a central point of when the Securities and Exchange Commission came in and did their cease and desist order against the state in 2013. And the state Supreme Court as well, they weighed in on some of these very points in time that I was looking at. And so, you know, what we have clearly is a you know, $100 billion debt right now and no plan to pay for it. And that's you know, all these pieces came together, and it was an interesting history lesson even for me, having lived through it. And you know, I think you know, you can point the finger at Democrats, you can point the finger at Republicans, you can point the finger at labor unions. I think you can also point the finger at the press. I mean, we were sitting there watching all this stuff happen, and where were we? You know, a lot of things that happened down there, you know, you just sort of get accustomed to that's the way it's always been done, and you don't question. And I myself was guilty of that. But anyway, it was an interesting exercise, and I think, you know, I think as a state, you know, we got a problem on our hands, and we all realize that, and that was the gist of what I did.
Okay, round of applause. Peter, you're up next.
Sure, and I think understanding the math continues to be a challenge because in order to actually deal with the solutions and the political issues, and I'm sure, Sheila, you'll get into that too, and Eric, understanding the math and the enormity, the numbers we're talking about, the $100 billion, if you cannot understand that, then it will be difficult to find what solution is relevant and what solution is not. I actually started this journey similar to that of Dave. I actually, when I was with the SEC, by the way, one of the things I like to describe myself is that I used to go after bad guys, and now I help people who are misunderstood by the government. And, but at the time at the SEC, I was the head of the unit in the Midwest that oversaw all municipal securities and public pensions investigation in the Midwest. Let's just say we were very busy at the SEC. And I was tasked with overseeing the investigation into bond offering disclosure by the state of Illinois in connection with their bonds, particularly on the accuracy of the pension liability disclosure. If you look at the bond offering document, time after time after time, general obligation bond by the state of Illinois, it will say the following, and I'm paraphrasing, but the key words are sufficient and necessary. The state told the investing public that it has a funding plan that would be sufficient and necessary to pay for its public pension. We focused on that, and I started the digging. And I spent a lot of time with actuaries, which is, you know, an interesting crowd.
I bet.
And one of the things that I learned, and I want to just quickly highlight 3 things that the SEC learned that reflected problems with the state's disclosure. 1, the state of Illinois at the time, based on the legislation in 1995, employed a very unorthodox actuarial funding plan. It is, in short, it's called the PUC, or projected unit cost. Nothing wrong with it, other than the fact that very few people ever use it. And what it does is that it, and this goes back to my quote of a balloon mortgage on steroid, is that usually if you look at actuarial funding plan, let's say the curve is like this. If you look at the PUC, the curve is like this, which is that it assumes a large amount of the payments assumed will be done at the end of the period, of the projected actuarial period. Second thing the SEC found under our investigation, which is that almost all states have an actuarial projection of 30 years. The state of Illinois' funding plan is based on an assumption and projection of 50 years. So graphically, look at this. From this to this, from this to that. That's part of the math. And then similar with Dave, then we look at the pension holidays under the Blagojevich administration. And again, you know, it's tough to assign motive at the time because it is easy for us now, but in order to really understand this, it is difficult to look at each solution during that particular moment in time that might make sense. You kind of have to look at the past, and you really have to look ahead to the future, in this case, 50 years, right? A 50-year period. The public pension holiday, I think the best thing, and I remember as a trial lawyer, I was thinking, well, if I have to litigate this, how will I describe it? And the best thing I would look at is just like if you have credit card debt. And just say, isn't this great? We're going to skip 3 months of payment. There, I can enjoy these 3 months. Isn't that great? And we know what that means in terms of digging a hole that is deeper and deeper, and the compounding effect of that. So those were 3 things that we found. And then when we compare those 3 things to the words sufficient and necessary, we got a securities fraud. Now, one thing I will say, the settlement was relatively light, and it was a cease and desist order. The goal of the SEC was to get the truth out, not unlike what Dave and others have done. But the reason why it was a relatively light settlement was because, and the order of the SEC recognized that, which is that Governor Quinn, during his administration, before the SEC investigation, actually started taking proactive steps to improve the disclosure on this offering document. In fact, one of the fascinating things for securities lawyer, we call it materiality, is that if you compare the market before the remedial disclosure by Governor Quinn and after, the yield changed drastically, which means the undisclosed facts were material to the investing public. And I would end by saying what is and what was material to the investing public is material to the voting public.
All right, round of applause. Eric, you're up.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk about Illinois' pension mess, something that my wife refers to as my mistress, since this is a topic that I have been working on for the Senate President since April of 2010. What I wanted to do, and I do have a packet for you, it's all on your table there, it's really to give you sort of a general overview, historical account of this mess that we're in. And really, there are 2 take-home remarks that I'd like you to get from my remarks today. First, pension funding has historically been a political football and something not to worry about until tomorrow. And so past governors and general assemblies really only made the contributions after they had already made contributions on things that were politically popular. And if you think about it in a cartoon sort of fashion, this approach is sort of epitomized by Wimpy from the old Popeye the Sailor Man cartoons, which is, I'll gladly pay you on Tuesday for a hamburger today. And so simply put, pension funding for the system, it was shortchanged really as a way to stave off the pain of tax increases or service cuts. The second point is that our current pension disaster cannot be blamed on benefit increases or salary increases. Between 1985 and 2014, pension unfunded liabilities grew by $97 billion. Benefit increases only accounted for 8% or $8 billion of that growth. Pay increases were actually less than what actuaries assumed they would be, and actually helped bring down the unfunded liabilities by about $1.3 billion. The state's failure to properly fund the pension system, however, accounts for 49% or 47% of that growth. So simply put, the main reason we are in this mess is because of insufficient pension contributions.
You got a couple of things.
I know, a couple, yeah.
No self-interest either.
No. But I worked on a report, and Chicago-Kent College of Law published a law review article back a year ago. And I really wanted to delve into the history of the causes of underfunding. And what I had come across was a report produced by a legislative agency called the Pension Laws Commission that reported that this underfunding crisis that we have is something that existed in 1917. And what that report said is the pension systems are nearing insolvency and moving toward crisis. And it really stemmed from the fact that the state was not properly funding the systems. And throughout many decades of reports, it was continued with the fact that you need to get a handle on these pensions. because it's going to provide some insurmountable obstacle for taxpayers, and you should not let one generation have to pick up the tab of a prior generation. I have on one of the slides here is the first one is I wanted to show you on the first slide is that when we had the Constitutional Convention in 1970, the pension system was really no better funded than it is today. You'll see all the way on the left-hand side, the data point is 41.8% funded. Today, we're 42.9% funded. So not much has really changed between where we are today versus where we are at the time that the pension clause to the Illinois Constitution was added. And I wanted this chart also to have some context because you could see that between in the last 4 decades, we've been somewhere between 40 and 60% funding. But we did have, for example, in 1995, when the funding plan was added, we were 52% funded. We had a high watermark in 2000. We were almost 75% funded. And on the very right, you'll see in 2013, the systems were 41% funded, and then they went up another 2%. They went up 2% because we had some very good stock market returns. The next slide, I think, gives you some scale for the scope of unfunded liabilities. Back in 1970, we had unfunded liabilities about $1.5 billion. In 1983, I'm highlighting that because we actually had a change in policy on how to fund pensions. Prior to 1973, this state had no funding policy that was consistent whatsoever. Again, it was a political football. Beginning in 1973, they started utilizing what's called a payout policy. So if the pension funds were going to pay $1 million in benefits, the General Assembly would cut a check to reimburse what was paid out in benefits. So we would have employee contributions or stock market gains. They could be put in the bank and they can help bring down or keep stable funding for the system. And if you look back at the last chart, it actually helped us out in the late 1970s to have some relative stable funding and maybe get to almost 50% funding. Beginning in 1982, 1983, there was a change in funding policy. Instead of doing 100% payout, the Thompson administration decided we're only going to do 60% payout. And also, we're also going to put more of our eggs in the basket of the stock market to fund pensions rather than through employer contributions. The other point that I wanted to make is that we had, and what led into the adoption of the 1995 funding plan, is we had a doubling of the unfunded liability from $8 billion to about $17 billion between 1989 and 1994. It was a political issue at the time between Dawn Clark Netsch running as a Democrat against Jim Edgar. And that's what prompted the current funding schedule that we have today. We did have, of course, some pension holidays that were discussed in 2006 and 2007. And the last thing I'd like to mention on this chart is that you can see that we had a tremendous growth in our unfunded liabilities beginning in 2007. We had about $35 billion in unfunded liabilities in 2007. We have gained another $63 billion in unfunded liabilities since that point. And just the last slide very quickly. I think this is the heart of the matter. In 1984, this state had pension unfunded liabilities of $7 billion. We currently have $105 billion. I have put, this chart really gives you a breakdown of where that $97 billion came from. And you can see at the top bar, the biggest contributor is the fact that the state did not contribute enough. That was $47 billion. At the end, the next being, of course, there were some changes in actuarial assumptions. And what I mean by that is, very recently, the pension funds have had their actuaries assume that you're going to get less in the stock market. And by making an assumption to get less in the stock market, you inflate the unfunded liabilities. But you cannot lay it at the feet of benefit increases coming about between 1985 and 2014. And you cannot put it at the feet of salary increases either.
There's that same guy again.
That's right.
All right, Eric.
So the last point
finish up.
The last point is, you know, the reason why, and this is something that came from a 2009 report from the General Assembly of why were we not properly funding. And this is what that report said. We have a state fiscal system that is so poorly designed that it failed for decades to generate sufficient revenue growth, both to maintain service levels from one year to the next and to cover the state's actuarially required contributions. Thank you.
Okay, Eric. Your round of applause. A lot of facts, Eric, and on this issue that's often been somewhat missing. All right, Sheila, you're up next, and bring us all together.
Well, the reason that we're in this financial mess is because they do not use truth in accounting when they calculate the budget. They use what we call political math. Now, the state doesn't just have a balanced budget requirement for the fun of it. The reason that they have a balanced budget requirement is, as Eric pointed out, that one generation should not push its current bills onto future taxpayers. But every single year, the legislature has come out and said, we have balanced the budget. So how can they balance the budget and put us into debt at the same time? Well, they use political math. Now, under the balanced budget requirement, all it says is, in essence, that your funds available have to equal your expenditures. So I ask you, if you borrow money, does that not become available for you to use? So they can borrow money and include that as revenue in the balanced budget calculation. Also, notice that it says expenditures. It does not say expenses. So it's only the checks that you write. So in the press, often you will hear a conversation about the unpaid bills. Well, there's a lot of unpaid bills because, in essence, the agencies hide bills in their drawers, vendor invoices, don't have the check cut because then they don't have to include that in their balanced budget calculation. And the biggest one of them all is compensation costs. They do not include all of the compensation costs when they calculate the budget. Compensation is not just made up of salaries and the paychecks that you write. It is also made up of health care benefits, pension benefits, and retiree health care benefits. All of that cost should be included as current cost in the budget, not when you write the check, the expenditure. And the way that the legislature has avoided including those costs in the current budget has been to not properly fund the pension plans. I responded to Dave's Crane's article with that this is why we're in the mess. The long-term costs, you mentioned bills of just, can you imagine going and buying a car and not looking under the hood? They give you a good price on it, and you're like, oh, well, they pushed it off the lot, but I really didn't know that there was a problem, and that, that just because I paid a cheap price for it, I thought everything was fine for it. How can you imagine passing billions of dollars of bills and not knowing how much they cost? But they do that routinely down in Springfield. Under our proposal, you would know the long-term costs before you pass these bills. For example, in 2002, they passed an early teachers retirement option. Well, the reason they did that is, again, because of the accounting. They were $62 million short to figure out how to balance the budget. So they had to cut somewhere. So they decided to get rid of employees. Well, the good way to get rid of employees is to offer them an early retirement option. You could retire at 50 versus 60 and get the same benefits. They didn't ask or calculate how much that would add to the unfunded liability. They just looked at, it balances the budget the way we calculate. Well, under our calculation, you would have to include the addition that you added to the unfunded liability as a current expense and find revenue to fund it. That one piece of legislation that theoretically saved the state $62 million of salaries cost the state added $2.4 billion to the unfunded liability, okay? And it's all because they don't do the accounting right. The SEC came in and they rightfully tried to protect the investors from the misstatements of the state. I ask you, who is out there trying to protect you and the taxpayers from the misstatements that they're making to you, that we are balancing the budget? And finally, Illinois is not alone, I hate to tell you. We have done calculations for 518 taxing districts in Cook County. So if you're a resident of the city of Chicago, you'll see how much each one of you owes. For Chicago's, each person's, we calculate that each person is in debt for the state to a tune, the state is $184 billion in the hole. Each person's share of that is $4,500. You would have to send every taxpayer in the state needs to send a check down to Springfield for $45,000 to make up the shortfall today. Now, these are costs that you're going to have to pay in the future. You're going to be taxed in the future. Future taxpayers are going to have to pay them, and they're going to receive no goods or services for those. Talks about taxation without representation. So your share of Illinois is $45,000. Your share of Chicago's is $28,600. Your share of Cook County's shortfall is $5,100, and your share of CPS's shortfall is $12,700. So each taxpayer in Chicago is on the hook. These are not costs that are going to happen now. These are, in essence, your credit card balance today for $91,400. And we didn't want to totally depress you and put the federal government number on there. So we left the federal government number on there. If you had a light lunch, you can ask me afterwards how much that is.
All right, Sheila, can you close it up, because you're just bringing all this good news. Keep going.
And I will stop with that good news.
Very good. Round of applause for Sheila. Well, by the way, as always, we do have hemlock in the lobby for those of you who think you can't take it anymore. Before we go to the questions, let me introduce, we have students from reporting and writing course from Columbia College who are sitting in the back. Raise your hands, kids. There they are. Give them a round of applause. And their professor, whose name I forgot, and I apologize. So, all right, here we go. Now you know there's a new system here, as I make it up. For all you aging baby boomers, remember Meet the Press, Lawrence Spivak, to ask the first question? Just take my, thank you for the nod, I appreciate it. You didn't applaud. All right, so my question to any one of you, or all of you, but real brief answer. All of you say how we got in here, and it's always bad news, worse news, all the other kind of stuff. How do we get out of it, other than writing a $91,000 check?
I will start with, write the check. I will start with just that, one, you need to, honestly understand where you are, how much you need to understand how much current bills cost. But as taxpayers and people, the voters watching this, what you need to do for this issue is consider this a cash shortfall. And the only way to fix a cash shortfall is to bring more money into the system or take less money out of the system. So as you view any alternative that the other panelists mention, or any of the alternatives that your politicians might tell you, just ask yourself, is it bringing more money into the system, or is it taking less money out?
Good answer. Anyone on, Dave, you want to jump in? Or?
Well, I think it's pretty clear based on that May Supreme Court ruling that in terms of solving this problem, you're not going to take it out of the the pockets of the retirees. That is absolutely clear.
There you go. That's it.
But
by the way, we have a limit of 4 applause. Right? You've reached your limit. Go ahead.
But moving forward, that's clearly a place that can be targeted. And in 2011, there was a bill that passed the legislature that Quinn signed that dealt with establishing different tiers. It's not entirely clear whether that's going to withstand a challenge later on, because you've got a whole question. Is that benefit that's guaranteed under Tier 2, going to be equal to what you would get under Social Security? Unclear right now, but clearly looking ahead, you can do that. What we're stuck with, though, is that $100 billion amount kind of in between there. We can deal with the problem moving forward, but what we've racked up to this point is the problem, and it's going to, I think, probably going to have to involve some revenue increases along the way. I mean, you see Rahm Emanuel and what he's doing now with the city police and fire pensions and the big property tax hike. I mean, I think you need to stay tuned at the state level that, you know, if not now, then somewhere down the line, somebody's going to come calling with that same bad news.
Eric, what's your solution?
Revenue increases is going to have to be a major component of it. You could do some changes.
Now you're over it.
Right.
That's enough.
You may not like this next. You could do some benefit changes, provided that they're not unilateral changes, such as what we saw with the bill that was thrown out by the Supreme Court in May. You could use contract principles to get some changes, but it's going to only mitigate the problem. I don't think there are any 200-yard Hail Mary passes that can be thrown that would give us a solution.
Peter, bring us together.
Well, looking at this as a mathematical problem, again, typically, if you attack a mathematical problem, you try to attack every variable, not just one. So for instance, sometimes people talk about increasing tax. That's just one of the variable. Obviously, that's in consideration. But one thing I will mention about increasing tax, again, hate to be this math geek, because I'm not really. I did calculus, but I was okay, which is that, as many of you know, all of you know, increasing tax rate is not necessarily the same thing as increasing tax revenue. Okay, that's a very important, basic thing. Increasing the tax rate sounds good, but that's just a multiplier. What people want to do is grow the revenue, and that comes the rub. How to do that is a very interesting political issue. But just remember, just saying let's just increase the tax rate does not guarantee that the money is going to flow into the coffer. The other thing, a variable, obviously is expense. But understand, when we talk about expense, we're talking about, among other things, our school kids, our public education, our public safety and structure. So yes, that is a variable, but you can only milk so much on the tax revenue side, you can only milk so much on the expense side. Of course, the untouchable, unmentionable, is the actual size of the benefits. That is mathematically a variable, but politically is viewed as a constant. And in part is because of the Supreme Court decision by the state of Illinois. However, there will be a point, and that's part of the understanding the math and the inevitability and the avoidance of denial, which is the number is so big that you can't just focus on one variable. There will be a point, potentially, if things are not done on all the variables, where the choice is going to be the benefit for the retiree or education for your kids. And when that happens, the unthinkable options become thinkable. And so at this stage, right, each year you wait, the hole gets deeper. I think the best thing to do is to assume everything is a variable in this equation, and you should think about attacking all of the variables.
Yeah, the problem is so big, I don't think you have an option of, correct me if I'm wrong, that you have an option of not touching every single thing. Right. That is possible.
Right.
All right, well, that's very good answers. All right, here we go, real fast. No need to go into detail. Joel Henning here from Joel Henning and Associates, a very simple question. Make these one-word answers, because we're moving along. Joel, always on top of things, says, should sensible people, not in quotes, get the hell out of Chicago and out of Illinois?
No.
Eric?
No.
David?
No.
Sheila?
They might think about it.
All right.
We set you up for that.
There you go. She, very good. John, is it Mick? Okay. Baxter and Weedman. Well, you know, penmanship is really slipping. I want you to know that. Now, but I do like this DPES. Very good. I noted. My firm works for 150 municipalities. Their leaders understand the P problem. Joe and Mary a lot of things here. Joe and Mary taxpayer don't and aren't worried. What will it take for the public to demand change? Wow, what a good question, and a lot of proper names.
More articles from Dave McKinney.
You see where that got him?
Yeah, exactly.
I think what you need to do is the taxpayers are going to have to feel the pain. And the way that the taxpayer feel the pain is through their pocketbooks. And the citizens of Illinois, honestly, have been getting government that costs this much. They've only been paying this much. And over the years, if they would have had to raise taxes or cut other goods or services, maybe the citizens would have woken up. But because they've been able to hide the cost and pretend it only costs, it does equal the revenues, they have actually left the citizenry out of this problem. So I think until, again, the citizens feel it in their pocketbooks, they're not going to pay attention to it.
All right. Probably most people agree with that. All right, Steve Carmody, even though you're not a member of the City Club, and you get one mulligan, by the way, Steve, unless you join for $50, this will be your first and last question. It's a tough time, okay? It's a tough time. MWRD Retire Fund Trustee. What are other miscellaneous factors under causes of the state pension system's unfunded liabilities chart? 17%. If anyone understands that question.
Yeah, that's
on
right up your alley. That's on the slide here, the third slide.
Okay, good.
The miscellaneous factor takes into account one-time adjustments. In addition, when they change over from one actuary to the next, it's not something that's attributable to benefit increases.
Okay, good answer.
Keep in mind the actual assumptions when they change. What that means is obviously the unfunded liability increases if it goes in that direction. The unfunded liability increases, but what that means is that they were paying, the contributions they were paying were too low before. So it's not just that, all of a sudden these unfunded liabilities increased. Well, the reason is because you weren't contributing enough before.
Okay, we have two Chicago Pension Fund questions. One from Raymond Wall, who is a member, obviously gets preference. Are Chicago, Illinois pensions broke on purpose? This is the City Club. You got questions like this?
I think the answer is no, in the sense of, I think that it takes, if you look at the history, and I think Dave's article bears in mind, and we were just talking about that earlier, I think very often you can have people acting in perfectly good faith for the moment and at the moment. I think one of the challenge about the entity called the public pension is that it is not something where you can just focus in the present. Remember what I talked about earlier in terms of actuarial assumption going back for 50 years? Imagine forcing people to think about what to do for the next 10 years, 20 years, and 30 years. And I'm not saying that's good faith or bad faith. It's just that it seems to me that with our current political situation and society, we tend to focus on what happens this year as opposed to what happens 30 years from now, 20 years from now. The problem is that now we are at that 30-year mark, 50-year mark, and so forth. So I don't think it's necessarily on purpose.
Well, I don't know if I would say it's on purpose either, because I think, in looking at these mileposts along the way, again, you just come back to this idea that the numbers that were on the table were grossly, underestimated, or they weren't there at all. And I think one of the striking things in my reporting.
Well, shouldn't you ask for them?
I think one of the reporting things that I turned up here that I thought was interesting was when I reached out to Governor Thompson and asked him about the COLA, the compounding COLA, because COGFA, I think, or maybe it was the pension systems, in 1990 had come out with an estimate that the long-term cost of that compounding 3% COLA was going to be over $1 billion. And so when I reached out to Thompson, I asked him, did you know when you signed that bill that was the cost that went along with that? And surprisingly, he said, no, I didn't know that. Had I known, I wouldn't have signed it. And that I mean, I guess hindsight's great, but that is emblematic, I think, of what we have seen along the way.
I think the question really should be intent versus negligence.
But they knew that they were increasing costs, and so it's sort of like me telling my husband, well, I didn't know that the credit card balance was going to be so high and our minimum payments were going to go up when I charged all those things. I was just charging things, and I really didn't know how much it was going to be. Did they do it on purpose? Well, what they did on purpose was get reelected. And their way to get reelected was they didn't want to raise taxes and they didn't want to cut goods or services. They knew how much they should contribute into these pension plans. They had the Edgar ramp, but they also had the schedule of required contribution from the employer, which their actuaries calculated every single year, and which they underfunded every single year by a lot.
We covered that, Sheila. We got a lot more questions. We covered it. By the way, 1989, Jim Thompson was not running for re-election. That was his last 2 years in office, as we all know.
But his party was.
Well, okay, but don't. By the way, does anyone know who the governor was in 1917? When this all started?
Ford.
That's a quiz. Look it up. All right.
I knew.
The answer is Loudon. Okay, here we go. Now we have Gene Freed, who's not a member. Same rules, Gene. Chicago Teachers Union, retired. Why has the state not considered a financial transaction tax? There he goes again. Like a seal. Go ahead.
I don't know.
Anyone want to touch that one?
Well, there are a couple of things. One
Come on,
is,
Peter, you're the expert.
Well, actually, I'm not, but I do think sometimes, things that may be tempting are not the answer because, one, people do and businesses can vote with their feet. That is a reality. And secondly, so basically, if the tax gets high enough, people don't have to do business in Chicago. I like to think that Chicago is a great city and no one ever wants to leave. But can I give you an example? You would like to think that a tropical paradise would be a place that no one ever wants to leave, right? Everyone is leaving Puerto Rico right now. So just remember that. And then I think the second thing, again, is what we discussed earlier, which is just because you have a tax is not the same thing as increasing revenue.
Right.
And I think the big question is really from the revenue side, how do you grow the revenue so that we can have an easier time? And again, just saying let's raise the taxes, just the multiplier, is not necessarily the answer.
Okay. Now we have a couple of real. We still have time because we pride ourselves on sandbag questions, but unlike other organizations, we say it in advance so you can.
You're doing great, by the way.
Thank you very much, Pete. I'm not going to get a raise either because my benefits are set. 0. All right, here we go. And worth every penny, I might add. This is from Frank Paul, one of our board members. And we have one from, hold on, so we can do these together, Vince Colbert. Vince, are you a member? You will be, right? Yeah. Okay. Frank is rather terse. What would the SEC do if private corporations funded their private pension plans like Illinois state and local governments?
Well, there are two answers to that. One is private corporations actually under a particular federal law called ERISA. But I think that one of the questions, which is what the SEC did, is focusing really on disclosure. The SEC is not involved in trying to manage the pension itself and whether it's good management. And I think that at this point, unfortunately, the truth is out. And so the SEC has done its job, which is getting the truth out. And I think with respect to whether it can be managed or not, that would not be the jurisdiction of the SEC.
I would just point out that in the private sector for years, there were some gamesmanship by private sector companies with their defined benefit plans to play around with the investment return it would get, and therefore trying to avoid the need to put money into their pension funds and try and provide some greater benefit to the shareholder value. You had sort of the same moral hazard that we're talking about today with public sector pensions as the same sort of problem that existed in the private sector. That's largely why they passed the legislation at the federal level in 2006 to knock out some of the practices that had been going on for decades with ERISA plans.
Okay, Vince Colbert gives a whole list of reasons, but the key point, aren't public employee pension benefits far richer than pensions of non-government employees, taxpayers, and in the private sector?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't think pensions are a fossil in the private world. I mean, they just don't exist.
But I do think that you need to look at the total compensation package. We need an honest accounting of, here's the employees' salaries, here's the health care benefits they earn, here's the pension benefits they earn, here's the retiree health care benefits they earn. Do the exact calculation on the private sector side, and then judge whether the total compensation is higher than the than the private sector.
I would just say in response to that, there was a University of Illinois study that came out within the last year that actually took up that issue, and they found, based upon the educational levels and backgrounds that folks have in the public sector, their compensation inclusive of pensions was less than their peers would get.
And what
in
the
private
politicians have done again, though, is they have paid the employees smaller paychecks, because remember, those are expenditures, and only expenditures get included in the budget, and then given them more generous pension and retiree health care benefits. And so therefore, those are kicked down the road, and that's why we're into the mess that we're into right now.
You know, I remember Governor Edgar back in the 90s would argue that public sector employees had generally a smaller sized paycheck, and that their benefits would sort of make up for that. And I don't know that that's true so much anymore, because it seems like you see lots of six-figure salaries and stuff that are showing up in some of the public payrolls. But I think it was true during a time that if you went to work for the state, it wasn't completely an altruistic thing, but I mean, your paycheck generally was smaller than it would be in the private sector, and that was the trade-off that everyone accepted.
Would the various public pension plans, Chicago, Cook, Illinois, be solvent even if the required contributions had been made? My point is that I'm skeptical that the numbers ever added up from the actuarial perspective.
Well, what we seem to find is we just completed our 50-state study, and again, we've looked at a lot of municipalities, and we find that there are a lot of municipalities, a lot of state governments that are paying their annual required contribution, and their unfunded liability is still increasing. Because, and a lot of times, for example, in the local municipalities in this area, they use like old mortality schedules, and so then again, the contribution and the unfunded liabilities are low, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh well, we need to go from the 1970s mortality schedule up to the 1990s mortality schedule. Their unfunded liability massively increases, even though they've been paying the ARC, the annual required contribution. The elected officials are like, well, what can we do? It's just an actuarial change. Well, you were paying too less in your contributions before, and you should have talked to your actuaries and made sure that they were using the right actuarial assumptions.
In the May opinion from the court, I thought it was interesting, and then Peter's finding as well, that the Edgar ramp, those first 15 years, I think there's a general recognition that there was underfunding going on in each of those 15 years when the state was paying, it sounds like a lot of money, $600 million a year, but when you compare that with the $7.5 billion we're owed now, there was underfunding with that too.
To answer your question, we would still have unfunded liability, but I don't think we would be having this conversation because the unfunded liability would be much, much, much smaller. So the other component about what Sheila was saying, there is a problem with the failure to update actuarial tables, and largely on the local level with some of the local pension funds. But at least for the state pension funds, they update them every 5 years.
Eric, to pick up on that, in this piece, Edgar made that point that he defended his plan. And what he said, the shortcoming of it was that all these points after he left, the Ryan early retirement plan, there were some benefit enhancements in the late 90s, but the early retirement plan, the pension holidays, the Edgar ramp wasn't recalibrated later on, and that was his argument. It should have been, and wasn't.
Well, I don't think too many people in this room would be against longevity. On an assumption, but
yeah, but longevity doesn't happen all of a sudden. People.
Let's hope not.
People know that people are getting older and older.
I want to enjoy it for a while, okay?
People are getting older and older, and a lot of times they just don't adjust those schedules. And so Social Security is a good example.
From Dan Montgomery's question for Dave McKinney to bring us together to close out the discussion. Dave, you're up. This is your big moment. Now that the Supreme Court has ruled that benefits can't be cut, big strong letters, and we know benefits aren't a problem, what will create the political will to properly address the funding issue? Kind of a repeat question, but so well written, and it's sticking you, Dave.
You say the best one for last there.
Absolutely. You can handle it.
It's a really good question. I don't, you know, we're seeing it play out in the city here. We're seeing, you know, the problem get to the point where there has to be something done. I think what's striking right now in Springfield is that we have this impasse, and it's stopping everything. And I think, you know, what I thought that May ruling was going to do was lay out on the table, this is our #1 priority. And instead, we don't have that at all. We have, you know, the governor has taken action. He's put a 500-page bill out onto the table, but clearly, you know, he's dealing with the Democratic legislature, and he puts collective bargaining language in there that you know, I think any astute observer would recognize as a poison pill. And you know, we're not hearing any discussion down there about what to do with this problem. And so, you know, I would say we get the impasse dealt with, and then maybe, you know, cooler minds will say, hey, this is a problem too, because, you know, what you saw with Quinn, I mean, I think we saw over and over with Quinn, he made this kind of the lead issue to his own peril. I mean, it cost him support in his re-election battle because the unions were not, you know, I mean, they were with him, but not the way they might have been otherwise. And so, you know, I think we have to have a different climate in Springfield than we do now to get this, you know, issue the attention it deserves.
Okay, how about a round of applause for this panel? Outstanding.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.
Hi, we're here at the Lincoln Heritage Museum at Lincoln College in Lincoln, Illinois, ready to unveil our brand new Lincoln Heritage Museum. The Lincoln Heritage Museum has existed at Lincoln College for 70 years, actually 70 years this year. We were in a different facility for many, many years. The collection that is now the Lincoln Heritage Museum started with one man's collection, Lawrence Stringer, who is an 1887 graduate of then called Lincoln University, now called Lincoln College. He willed his collection to the college in 1944 if the college would build a museum, and so we did. And so for many years we were in a museum in which we had tabletop display cases with many great items. The problem is that we ran out of space. Our collection is growing. We had conservation needs that the old museum, old cases couldn't accommodate. We had some funding opportunities, and all that sort of merged together for a possibility for a brand new museum. In 2010, we contracted with Taylor Studios out of Rantoul, and they began the design process, which leads us to where we are today in our brand new museum. And the museum is on 2 different floors. It has 2 different types of design approaches. The downstairs is more artifact-based, so the upstairs is a lot more interactive and immersive-based. And I'd like to begin by showing a few items here downstairs. Well, we're here looking at some of the items that we have downstairs in our artifact display area. And the first thing I would like to show you is the fact that many of our items here are in conservation-friendly display cases. Taylor Studios specifically designed these cases with our artifacts in mind, and they're very light-controlled, climate-controlled, and as well it allows us to showcase items in a way that tells stories. We have here behind me a table, a chair, and a book. And all these items represent Lincoln's legal career. We also have the heading Honesty and Empathy. What we've tried to do with our items is do 2 things. Number 1, tell stories with the items, because we don't want them to be stagnant pieces that are just there. We want them to be living things that represent stories about a person's life, in this case Abraham Lincoln's life. This law book was a very book that Abraham Lincoln used. It's a supplemental law book, and what Lincoln would read through this, it's a case study, and he would actually carry this with him when he would argue cases, when he was on the circuit, when he was in different courtrooms. So this very book Lincoln would have used. This chair comes from the Postville Courthouse, which was a courthouse on the circuit, the 8th Judicial Circuit in which Lincoln practiced law. So we have stories about these items, but we also then broaden the stories by talking about the people. For instance, we have John Stewart, Stephen Logan, William Herndon, and information about who these people were and why they were important in Lincoln's life. And as well, we have that merged with character qualities, because in the end, it's the characteristics of Lincoln, I think, that make him great. And honesty and empathy is one of the things that people most noted about him. Samuel Parks, we have a quote here from him that For 25 years, I knew this man. He's the most honest man I'd ever met. And so we tried to emphasize to the visitor that we have items, we have this man, Abraham Lincoln, but we also have the character qualities that he developed while using these items. While he practiced law, he developed honesty and empathy that carried with him his entire life. Well, we're here in a section we have titled Perseverance and Intellect. And again, going along with the character qualities of Abraham Lincoln, this particular case relates to how Abraham Lincoln developed perseverance and how he developed his intellect. The main piece that we have in this particular case is a table that Mentor Graham owned in his home in New Salem. Mentor Graham was a tutor, he was a teacher in New Salem, a very well-learned man. And Abraham Lincoln, who had only had less than a year of formal education, came to New Salem with that lack of education and met Mentor Graham. And at this table in Mentor Graham's home, Lincoln was tutored on math and English and the finer points of philosophy and ethics, all the sort of things that Lincoln himself would internalize and he would use to further his career, but also to further his intellect and to further his character himself. And I can just imagine at this table, Lincoln is poring over with books on a candle, with a candlelight, with Mentor Graham. And I think what's interesting is to juxtapose the table with this particular letter. This letter is a land agreement from Indiana from 1819 that bears the signature of Thomas Lincoln. Now, Thomas Lincoln was Abraham Lincoln's father. But what's interesting about it is Thomas Lincoln was largely illiterate. And so all he signed was the little X in between Thomas Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln became what I would believe to be one of the greatest wordsmiths I have ever met. The ability to put so much words together in the way he did, to me, is amazing. But I have to I have to contrast that with the fact that Lincoln came from this. He came from Thomas Lincoln, who was illiterate. And that middle ground between the great wordsman that Lincoln was and his father, who couldn't even sign his name, is right here at this table. I think this is the crossroads. This table represents Lincoln becoming the self-made man, and a man who wanted to grow his intellect all he possibly could. But of course, we don't just title it intellect, we title it perseverance and intellect, because Lincoln had to overcome all sorts of odds to get there. And I love pointing on this table, especially to kids, to show, look, Lincoln read. He read all he possibly could. And if you want to become an educated and intellectual person, like we all do, read, for heaven's sakes. And again, so this table represents so much about Lincoln, but also so much about what life was like in Lincoln's time. You know, one of the things that we have to do in a museum to tell the whole Lincoln story is to become very personal. In the end, Lincoln has to be made relatable, and he is a human being. And so one of my favorite cases downstairs is this case here, which goes into depth about the personal side of Abraham Lincoln, his family, and how he was personally affected by the war. So let me tell you a little bit about some of the items that we have in this particular case. The Lincoln family is what we prominently highlight in the background. We talk about Lincoln as a father and as a husband, and we talk about the Lincoln sons. We have here a rocking chair which belonged to Tad Lincoln. In fact, Tad Lincoln had etched his name in the back of the chair with a pocket knife. We encourage young kids not to do this when they go home. But the fact is that it's a very personal piece of the Lincoln history, of the Lincoln family. And these young boys, Willie and Tad especially, were a little rambunctious. And so we say, here's the Lincolns being the Lincolns. Also, we have a lock of Willie's hair. And Willie died in 1862 when Lincoln was president. And so a very, very personal piece of the Lincoln story. Another thing, though, I think that makes Lincoln personal in this case is how his friends and how the Civil War merged together. We have a story here of Elmer Ellsworth. Elmer Ellsworth was a colonel in the Civil War, but before he was a colonel in the Civil War, he was a friend to the Lincolns. He clerked for Abraham Lincoln in Springfield and then came out to Washington, D.C. With the Lincolns, played with Willie and Tad when Lincoln was president at the White House. And Colonel Ellsworth, originally from New York, raised a company of zouaves to volunteer. And then in May of 1861, Lincoln had commented that he could look out the White House window to Alexandria, Virginia, and see the Confederate flags flying. And that bothered Elmer Ellsworth because he knew it bothered his friend, the president. And so Elmer Ellsworth went to the hotel, took the flag down, and as he was coming downstairs was shot by the hotel owner. And this becomes the first death in the Civil War, the first officer's death in the Civil War. And Lincoln was personally affected by it. There were a company of men who went to the White House tragically, or saw Lincoln after this and saw how Lincoln was just beside himself, devastated by this particular death. And so the death of the Civil War was something that Lincoln could not escape. Edward Baker, another good friend of Lincoln's, also died in the Civil War, and it became very, very personal. And Lincoln was also very, very accessible. And also one of my favorite things about this case is we have some notes here that Lincoln wrote. And when weeping mothers would come, or there would be men who would come seeking political office, Lincoln would write out the notes. Or if there was someone seeking a pardon, Lincoln would write out these notes, and they would give to them. And it became something that Lincoln believed he had to do. He said, if these people only want to see me for a moment, and if they were satisfied, then that is what all I can do. And so again, the personal side of Lincoln really in many ways completes the story of who this man really, really was. Well, this is just a few of the items that we have downstairs on the first floor level of the Lincoln Heritage Museum, so we definitely want everyone to come and see these items and see so much more. I'd like to take you upstairs now to show you the different type of design that we have there. Well, we're upstairs here at the Lincoln Heritage Museum, and as I said earlier, we have two different types of approaches to our design. Downstairs, as I showed you, was the more artifact-based, which we have collections and original pieces that related to Lincoln. We also have stories that we talked about with those items. Upstairs, we still tell some of the same type of stories, and hopefully people will see the correlation between upstairs and downstairs with some of these stories. But this is a very different type of museum than you'll see downstairs. And we believe a very different type of museum than you'll see anywhere else as well. The upstairs design, we have two different types of modes. A mode where you can simply walk through, like we are right now, with the lights on, and objects